Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah McLean, and I'm really excited, and I feel really privileged to be here today to talk to you, to be on stage with these rock stars. So, Ian mentioned that I am Otipemisiwak, that I'm Métis, and the Métis people are one of 3 Indigenous peoples in Canada. It might sound basic. It's outlined in Section 35, but folks often don't understand that there's First Nations people, there's Métis people, and there's Inuit people, and we are very distinct. We have languages, cultures, histories that interact with each other, but are separate. And First Nations people are also not one huge group. There's hundreds of them across this country, across Turtle Island, and I think it's really important that we start our understanding and we start our conversations learning about my people, Ian's people, Ellen's people. So I'm going to get everybody in this room to say Indigenous. And when we say Indigenous, we're talking about 3 groups of people. They are... Okay, you did it. That's amazing. Now, when you're making policies and you're having these conversations, please reach out to us and start learning about us. It's okay if you don't have the right words. We're willing to talk to you about it. We're willing to share our histories and our culture and our knowledge with you, but we need to be lifting up knowledge holders from these communities.
Absolutely.
So I work primarily in Indigenous communities, and we come up with community-driven solutions to gender-based violence. Indigenous women experience violence at astronomical rates. 2 out of 3 Indigenous women in their life will be sexually assaulted. And that's inexcusable, and it is a shame. It's based on a history of white supremacy, of colonization, and of devaluing Indigenous women, Indigenous knowledge, and more so than just that violence, we also have Two-Spirit people in our community. Two-Spirit people can identify in the LGBTQ community, but in my culture, it's people who carry knowledge from both the women's teachings and the men's teachings. And our Two-Spirit people are experiencing violence at rates even higher than Indigenous women. So I think it's important to understand where that's coming from and to come up with strength-based solutions. I've worked with missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people's families for quite some time. And they understand more than most that this violence is coming from a place of devaluing of Indigenous people, of Indigenous women especially, but our men and boys are also being experiencing violence and being incarcerated at rates that are astronomical. There's been a lot of studies, there's been a lot of work happening around this. There's an inquiry right now into missing and murdered Indigenous women that is really challenging to watch. Families are coming forward and sharing some of the most difficult and awful things that anyone can experience, and then they are not getting the support that they are promised. And this inquiry came out of the work of folks like Ellen, folks like Jennifer Lord, and even Michelle Audette, who's one of the commissioners, to try and bring some justice to these families, and what they're being met with is inexcusable. It's really shameful. I'm hearing from a lot of families that we don't need more studies. We've been studied to death, often literally. You have the TRC, you have RCAP, you have inquiries and inquests that have happened since long before I was born, and these recommendations are not being adopted, implemented. We're not seeing meaningful engagement with this research once it's in place. So that's, for me, I personally don't think that we need any more of these. I think that we need to be looking to our communities and looking to our knowledge holders for solutions to these issues. And we need to be pushing policymakers, like all of you in this room, what you're doing this weekend, to start looking for accountability to Indigenous people. So let's talk about accountability. Let's have some really uncomfortable, gross conversations about how we are accountable to each other and how that accountability hasn't been seen. When the leadership race contest in Manitoba was taking place, there was an Indigenous woman who had experienced violence who was outed and had to relive that violence again. And instead of having people stand up for her and say, no, there is no excuse to ever threaten an Indigenous woman, especially not due to the fact that she experienced violence. Instead, people said, no, we don't believe her. You know, Me Too isn't just for white women. And, okay. So I'm putting it out to the people in this room. Indigenous women are watching you. Two-Spirit people are watching you. And when we have some justice for Tara, when we have justice for the thousands of women who have gone missing and murdered and experienced violence, then maybe we might start engaging in Canadian colonial politics. But right now, I don't really have a lot of time for it. So I'm not with WOB. And I hope that some accountability around that takes place. But please don't think for a second that I only want accountability when it comes to brown men. When it comes to Indigenous men, we need to be looking to people in positions of power, especially people who hold the most power, who are white, who are wealthy, who have been calling the shots and covering for people who perpetrate violence and perpetrating violence. So show me some accountability. Show Indigenous women some accountability, and we will be very excited to engage with you. One more point. The reason I did get you to all chant First Nation, Métis, Inuit, keep saying it, Indigenous people of Canada, all three, is that often the Inuit and Métis are an afterthought or not thought of at all. That exclusion takes place across the board. In the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women, there is no space, there is no research, there is no health supports going into Métis communities, supporting Métis people. They're not employing Métis people. This is also happening with the Inuit. I'm excited to be on stage right now with these people, but I'm also really bummed that there's no Inuit woman here, there's no Inuk woman here to share her experience or their experience, because it is vastly different. Oh. So that being said, I'm going to, for now, pass it over to Ellen Gabriel, who is one of the people I look up to most in this work. So thank you.
Wat konuratu sa kwego katitsa kwasna yujat stanu waganyatu kanya kahaga na gato datanu kana sadaga na kana gere dito hunzong da ahanda kataswati datitinu warado na sungwaya tizu datitinu warado na ka satsara so oyera datitinu warado na datitinu warado oni na yetenista ohunza tanu akwego de dawanara. So I want to thank you, and I did introduce myself that I'm Turtle Clan. And my Kanyakahaga name is Kazitsagwas, which means picking up flowers. And I come from a long line of Turtle Clan families. And I wanted to say that before I begin, I also want to acknowledge and greet the Creator, the natural life cycles, and our Mother Earth. Because without her, we are nothing. Our species cannot exist. And I wanted to greet all our relations, whether they are two-legged, four-legged, winged ones, the plants, and all those things that we are part of, we are not separate from. And that is what is Indigenous traditional ways of being is. It's a way of life. It's not a religion. It's who we are as a peoples on this beautiful little blue planet and hurtling around the sun. This is our spaceship. And I'm so happy that you invited us here today to be able to talk with you for a little while. And I want to talk about Indigenous peoples' rights as human rights. We are often looked at as having special rights. If we had such special rights, if we had more rights than you, then we should be the most richest people in this country, and we are not. And one of the most frustrating things for me, this is going to be 28 years that I've been doing these kinds of talks, to see that, yes, we are at an NDP convention that would not have happened 28 or 30 years ago. We are being noticed, but you have to notice us as human beings. And have to know that today colonization is not a thing of the past. It is still going on. When the government talks about their partners, their Indigenous partners, they are only talking to an elite group of people. They are not talking to Indigenous peoples. They are talking to the status quo of national Aboriginal organizations, and it's through they're not their fault. They are trying their best, and I mean no disrespect to them. But every single person is a rights holder. And as a rights holder, we are entitled to have our free, prior, and informed consent on what is going on our lands, our territories, our resources, what's happening to our children, what's happening to our human rights. Okay. As many before me have said, our rights are human rights. And I want to quote to you something from the Right Honorable Beverly McLaughlin, who is a Supreme Court Justice of Canada, who said, Aboriginal rights from the beginning have been shaped by international concepts. Canada, as a respected member of the international community, cannot ignore the new international norms. Whether we like it or not, Aboriginal rights are an international matter. And that goes to speak to what Indigenous peoples have said. During 1990, we said, we are sovereign people. We are not Canadian citizens. We are Haudenosaunee people, people of the Longhouse, and people who have never surrendered our sovereignty. And during that time, the federal negotiator said to us, we do not respect that the Tura Wampum does not apply to Canada. And so we are not treaty people, and therefore we never surrendered our land to anybody. And we want to have the rights of the women respected because in Iroquois culture, in the Longhouse, it's the women who are the title holders to the land. And last November, as people were celebrating the 10th anniversary of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, I spoke to Carolyn Bennett about the community struggle still. We went through the 1990 crisis where our fundamental human rights were violated by the Canadian Army, the Sûreté du Québec, condoned by both levels of government. And we are still struggling. We are still struggling with the same issue of 300 years ago. And Minister Bennett said to me, if you don't like it, take it to the courts. This is the kind of government we're dealing with. If you're going to be that government that respects human rights, you are going to have to learn about international human rights obligations to Indigenous people. You're going to have to learn to decolonize and what that actually means. That decolonization is actually about respecting every single person's sovereignty, because sovereignty starts with us as individuals. Sovereignty is our right as human beings to not have our spaces invaded. But also, for us in the Longhouse, we are supposed to protect those who cannot speak for themselves. That's why we honor them before every single meeting. And we say all those things from the land to the heavens. We think about them. And we think about those 7 generations. It's become a cliche now. And so I want you to promise us as Indigenous people, if we're going to take the NDP seriously, You're going to have to educate yourself about what human rights are. You're going to have to educate you're going to have to educate yourself on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And you're also going to have to ignore some narcissistic tendencies by certain provinces and territories about unsustainable resource development. Because we are human beings. Everybody wants to live well. Everybody wants to have a job so they can feed their families. But what kind of legacy are we, this generation, leaving for those ones who are babies right now? What kind of legacy are we leaving for them when they will not be able to drink their water? When the air will become so polluted that at an early age that they will have asthma, that they will have the kinds of diseases that we're seeing now. But yes, it's going on now. More and more people are developing cancer, and we cannot forget our elders. You know, people say to us, what about your elders? You know, you must have RRSPs. Our elders were the help. My grandparents cut the lawns, they did the housekeeping for the rich people in Hudson. We didn't have our RSPs. And so you're going to have to help our elders too. But I want you to say, I want to tell you about something that Frantz Fanon said. And this typifies colonization to its T. Colonization is not just about merely imposing its laws upon the colonized of the present and the future. It's with a kind of perverted logic. It turns attention to the past of the colonized people, and it distorts it, it disfigures it, and it destroys it. And the final aim of colonization was to convince the indigenous population that it would save them from the darkness. Well, we can save ourselves from the darkness. We know where the light is, and you have to be part of that solution. You're going to have to step up to the plate, because every time you talk about resource development, every time you talk about education, social services, the child welfare system with Cindy Blackstock, you're going to have to know what the rule of law is, and you're going to have to know what international human rights law is. So educate yourself, because I can tell you, I'm going to be 59 in a couple of months, and I'm really tired, and I can imagine how tired my ancestors were, because they reached out their hands in peace all the time, and we have reached out our hands in peace. Colton Bushy's parents called for peace. We are calling for peace all the time. Let it not be at the expense of this present and future generations to come, that in 30, 50 years from now, we are still talking about the same thing that we're talking about at this convention. Because you know what? Mother Earth doesn't need us to exist. We need her. And we need all our relations. So,
thank you so much, guys. We're going to start a little bit of a discussion on possible. I don't know. Let's just discuss. Let's just discuss. So you brought up land rights as being the foremost, one of the biggest. I've heard you speak before. Sorry, and being one of the most important resources that we have, or not just resources, but what this is all about. Like the rights, the indigenous rights, have to do with land, and it does. And I'm understanding more about that because the land doesn't belong to us. We're of the land, right? So our connection with it isn't that we own it; it's that it owns us. Like we're from this actual earth. Like we came here and grew up with it. Right, so that's the connection that I don't think that a lot of people understand. And you brought up legally a few times about what that means as a Haudenosaunee woman. And the disruption and entitlement of that land is very much reflected in the violence against women. And I think there's a direct line and correlation between the entitlement of resources and the entitlement of Indigenous women's bodies. Do you care to comment?
Well, you know, the Indian Act was designed to target the roles and authority of the women that they played in the nation. And so when we married a non-Indigenous person, the women had to leave. So like the Indian residential school system, it disrupted the roles of the women, the roles of the family. Can you imagine being a parent and your child taken away and you have no choice? Your children, you don't know, are being punished at school for speaking their language. So there are stories, and I'm going to say them, and some say, oh, it's too brutal. They had needles put in their tongue when they spoke their languages. They had their hands held over a hot flame over their languages. And our land and culture is part of us. Our languages are based on our relationship with the land. And we need to look at when we talk about human rights and the relationship, we need to look at it as the earth. You know, the lungs, you know, human rights are supposed to be interrelated, indivisible, universal. So if you look at it as an entity, as your lungs, so if part of your lungs are not working properly, then you're not enjoying a quality of life. So if one of your rights is being affected, you're not enjoying a quality of your human rights. And our land is the most precious thing that we can pass on to the next generation that is coming up. And it's always been the colonizer's excuse, as Romeo Saganash so beautifully and eloquently said in Parliament. There is a litany of excuses for Canada to delay, to delay, to delay. Why? You know, why we're not having the enjoyment of our self-determination. And, you know, the reconciliation means we get our land back. That's what reconciliation for me is about.
I see the concept of reconciliation and the way it's being discussed, a very colonial idea. And reconciliation, you know, it's reconciling with something that you did. And us as Indigenous people, we didn't do anything wrong, right? Reconciliation is for colonial Canada to figure out and come to us and be like, is this all right? Or like, what do you need? And thankfully, we've given that list a few times now, right? We've given that list through RCAP. We've given that list through the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. We've given it through the TRC, and we're still waiting for all of these to be implemented or even like recognized, other than like, hey, you wrote it, good job, and that's the end of it. That's the way it's always been. So we've given this roadmap on how to reconcile, even though it's not on us, and we did it 3 times already, right? Like when is it going to get picked up? When's the responsibility? The people that actually have reconciling to do, when is it going to get picked up, right?
I think there's a responsibility as well for mainstream Canadians to understand that when we're talking about our land and when we're talking about our body and when we're talking about each other and how we connect to each other, it's the same thing. So when we're talking about land sovereignty, we're also talking about sovereignty over the autonomy of our own bodies. So when you hear about women being forcefully, it's just my phone. When you hear about women being forcefully sterilized, that is the same issue as our land being taken. That is the same issue as our children being taken. It is all connected, and it is connected between the generations. So there needs to be a change in how we think about these issues and how we think about how Indigenous bodies and how Indigenous land is not something that other people are entitled to do with as they want.
Right, absolutely. Also, the taking of children, that's actually defined as genocide. Like under the UN, the United Nations Declaration and definition of genocide, displacing, like first it starts with the murder of a specific racially group, which obviously happened time and time again. And then you have, the displacement and the movement of children from one cultural group to another. That's a form of genocide. And nobody in Canadian that's making policy, you know, they've said cultural genocide. But no, it's purely unadulterated genocide, and it needs to be recognized as that.
I think that folks might hear these words often, but I think they don't take them on. There are more Indigenous children now in the child welfare system than total children ever went through the residential school system. So right now we are stealing children, we are taking them away from their families, we are setting up families to fail, and we're projecting these racist ideals to perpetuate this ongoing genocide. I don't understand how people aren't talking about this every single day, trying to come up with solutions. And there are people who are talking about this every day, and they get surveilled by the government instead of looked to as the knowledge holders who can guide us through this.
It's because there's money to be made on it. There's money to be made on Indigenous oppression. There's money to be made on the oppression of women's bodies. There's money to be made on all these things. That's why it's so hard to disrupt, because we've had this game of monopoly forced on us, and it's not meant for us. It was never meant for us. We were only used as currency forever. Like, we were like non-white bodies have been used for currency. For land, like displacing Indigenous people, like that was the currency. Cheap labor in the U.S., cheap labor in Canada. We don't talk about the history of slavery in Canada. We don't talk about the current occupation of Palestine. We don't talk about all of these situations. They're all connected, guys. This is all connected in the same way. Yeah. So having like all these understanding colonization, I think, as a global thing, and imperialism as a global thing, and not just, realizing it's here and that there's a checklist. You can go to Australia, and they have the history of the lost generation. They have the history of school-run places to that they took their kids to, and you know what I mean? Like, it's so similar to me that it can't be unintentional. Like, the colonization has like a huge checklist that they go through.
No,
right?
there's a purpose about empire building, and Canada has been a refuge for many people who are escaping torment in their own countries and in their own places of home. And yet for the Indigenous peoples in Canada, and indeed in the Americas, we are treated as if we are homeless. We are treated as if our rights don't matter. And there you have this whole Aboriginal industry ranging from institutions to the government of Canada, where they take at least 64 to 67% of the money that they purport to spend on Indigenous peoples each year for their budgets. When in actual fact, as the former Auditor General Sheila Fraser stated, it comes from an 1886 trust fund from the royalties taken from Resources and Minerals, a royalty fund that was taken. We're not using your tax-paying dollars. This is our money that Canada is using to rebuild our institutions from colonization. And I want to quote the Permanent Forum, because this is a problem that we all share. We're talking about Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples have been at the forefront of environmental protection. We have been at the forefront of climate change discussions. And the UN Permanent Forum on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples talked about in 2008 that the Permanent Forum calls for urgent, serious, and unprecedented action by the Economic and Social Council and General Assembly, along with all United Nations bodies and agencies, recognizing that climate change is an urgent and immediate threat to human rights, health, sustainable development, food sovereignty, peace, and security. And it calls upon all countries to implement the highest and most rigorous and most stringent levels of greenhouse gases reduction. What are we doing? What are you guys doing in Canada about reduction of the greenhouse gases? Do we really need to base our lifestyle on an unregulated free market economy that doesn't give a damn about the rights of the people it tramples on, the rights of the people who were first on this continent, the first peoples of this land? We have been suffering through the people who are living around the tar sands. We have been suffering for so long. It's time that we are rising now. We have been slowly rising over these generations. We're not going to be quiet anymore. We are not going to be nice anymore, because it doesn't seem to hit home. But we will always offer our hands in peace and friendship. But we're not letting you trample on our rights anymore. I'm sorry.
Absolutely, especially like just to get current in news and stuff, hearing the Justin Trudeau talk about it's time to implement new justice reform for Indigenous people and their rights and stuff, and it's to me, I just don't know why we need other people to implement our rights for us, especially rights that they don't have. Who are they to give me rights that they don't even have? It's up to us as Indigenous people to assert these rights and to exercise these rights. And it's up to non-Indigenous people who create policy to actually sit and listen to what we have to say and work together in all of this and incorporate these values, incorporate these ideologies.
I want to touch on those Indigenous people who are knowledge holders. You have you have many brilliant MPs. You have Romeo Saganash, who is a rock star, but you also have Georgina Jolibois. I'm sorry, my family's French too. It's embarrassing. But she is brilliant. She is legitimately brilliant, not only in the House, but when she was mayor. She has so much knowledge from her community, from her life experience, and I'm shocked that I'm not seeing her lifted up by this party, given a place of platform to speak to these issues. I haven't seen her this whole convention. I've been in and out. But please don't tokenize our women. Please don't use our women as a means to an end when they are so brilliant, when they are so bright, when they have so much knowledge and different ways of doing things. Indigenous organizing and community building is really exciting. It's really inspiring, and we have a lot to learn from folks like Georgina, from folks like Ellen. So lift them up, listen to them, and please don't tokenize them because we see it. Electing an Indigenous woman is not enough.
And I want to explain to you what the Longhouse is. It's not a building. The eastern door is where the sun rises. The western door is where the sun sets. The earth is the floor and the sky is our ceiling. It's not a building. It's a concept. And the Longhouse people, the Haudenosaunee people, have always tried to welcome other nations to come sit under the tree of peace. And there is a parallel in the living tree doctrine, which is in Western society's law, and that it accommodates that you add to the rafters for us in Kainarat Goa, the Great Law of Peace, where you add to the rafters. And so you need to add to the rafters to accommodate the times that the people are living in. Your parliamentary process is archaic. It is not representative of you, the people. It is represented, it's not just a vote. In our ways, the people understood what their responsibilities were as children. They tried to keep going, because we knew that if the land suffered, we suffered. And that's what you need to do, is to look and examine why things are the way they are. Why can't we leave the children with something better than what we're going to be leaving them? Because we don't need any studies to tell us how it's going to be in 20, 30, or even 15 years. We know that the waters are rising. We know that there's invasive species taking away the biodiversity. We know that we're living in a greenhouse. And we've known that since the 60s. Can you imagine? Since the 60s. I was a kid in the 60s. And yet we continue to make the same mistakes. You have to be different than those other political parties. You have to be. You cannot continue the status quo. We're watching you. I don't vote. And maybe, this is like a bad thing in your eyes, but I don't vote because I am a person of the Longhouse. I am a citizen of my nation, and we never gave up that right. We want to live with you as allies. But as allies, you have to recognize the authority and the roles that the people play in the earth. And we need to look, how much money is enough for one person? Really, how much is it? Why is there homeless people in one of the most richest countries in the world? So I appeal to your sense of humanity. I really want you to take what I'm saying seriously. We don't need to keep protesting. We don't need to have more people being shot in the back of the head and the murderer found not guilty. We don't need to lose any more of our youth. And we need to keep you, and we need you as our allies to help us do that. You make the change. Your children will make the change with or without you, because I've been speaking to your youth, and they want change.
Is there anything else we want to touch on? There's one thing that I wanted to touch on. There was, I mentioned earlier that there was a Jesuit who made contact with the Nipissing people. And it was the first time, like, you know, again, it's seen through this horrifying, judgmental colonial lens and very negative, but it was the first time I was able to see how my people lived pre-contact. And he described all kinds of things, and one of them was the promiscuity of my people, and it was really, like, I was really taken aback by it. But he also described the civility and the equality that was in it, and the respect that was done. No matter the promiscuity, it was always done with respect, and it was always done with he didn't use civility, but he used respect and equality. And to me, it dawned on me that violence against women is a colonial concept. Like, the violence against women, but that wasn't even something that we thought of. You know what I mean? And from my I know my culture, it was patriarchal, and the men do sit and make the decisions. But I know that is not in any shape, way, or form the same thing. Like, our communities are actually, I don't know, 6 or 7 hours apart, but our languages and cultures are as different as English and Chinese. And this is something that a lot of people don't understand, is the diversity in languages, the diversity in cultures, and we need to be really sensitive to all of those things when we take on all of this policy that everybody seems to be talking about.
Colonization could not have been as successful as it is today in 2018 if it did not attack the women. And if we did not have the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women to the extent that we do today. And, you know, I really feel that we need to do better. We can do better, even amongst ourselves. We need reconciliation amongst ourselves as Indigenous people. We need to have that time to be able to have reconciliation amongst ourselves. But we're always busy about, you know, pipelines, new legislation coming out, and it's always on the colonizer's version and interpretation of who we are as Indigenous people. Even today, I am not an Indigenous person under the Indian Act. I'm an Indian under the Indian Act. I am still an Indian. You know,
with an Indian status card.
Yeah,
right?
and when you talk about promiscuity, that was the Jesuit. I mean, this guy takes an oath to celibacy, so anybody would be promiscuous, right? So it depends on the interpretation of history, and we want to have our version, our stories of history, whether it's pre or post contact, into the schools, and we need to educate your kids. We need to educate every lawyer, every judge, every politician. They need to have all the same kind of education that we have been. We took the time to learn about our history. We take the time. And this year, well, 2019, Canada will be introducing an Indigenous Legislation Act just before the election. To me, that says that they are not moving fast enough, because we are losing the first language speakers faster than we are losing our languages. And we need those people to be at the head, those elders to teach us all that traditional knowledge that has embedded in our languages, because they are precious. We cannot go to Europe where English, Polish, French, all these other languages are spoken. This is where we speak our languages, and this is where we need to start. So our languages are precious and a part of our right to self-determination.
Absolutely. I see our language as being that instructions to UNO, like what I was saying before. Like, everything in our language is the intent behind it, again, is to be inclusive, to be connected, to be all these things. I was taught that in our language of Anishinaabemowin, it's really hard, because we're so descriptive, it's really hard to lie or be sarcastic. So as I'm thinking in English, where my taproot of thought right now is English, because my language was decimated in a time where, like, it overlapped. My great-grandmother was alive, and she never learned English when I was alive, okay? And I went to her house. I hung out with her when I was a baby, but I was alive at the same time, and I never learned Ojibwe. Right? So that disconnect was alive at the same time. This is how close it was. And a lot of people don't understand that. And Trevor was going with, like, oh, so not being able to lie. So I'm thinking in a way that, you know, I can use sarcasm, I can dissuade, I can portray something in a different light, where our languages were so to the point, well, Anishinaabe language was so to the point that it was so descriptive that it was hard to lie. Like, you couldn't lie. So imagine having now a taproot of thought collectively where you couldn't lie or be sarcastic. Right?
Yeah,
like, that's how important
exactly.
these languages are, and different from what they were. Sorry.
And as we said, like in our language, it's 80% verbs.
Yeah.
You know, so it's really difficult. It's a moving language, right? Languages are alive. You know, c'est comme la langue française, c'est vraiment une belle langue, mais c'est difficile d'enseigner aussi. So the French is a beautiful language, but it's also very difficult to learn. It takes 5 to 7 years to learn my language of Kanien'keha. And Kanien'keha is my first language. Both my parents were Mohawk, by the way. They were both Kanien'keha. I know people like to assume because I'm more fair, but both, and I grew up in the community. And every time I would hear the people speak, they would be laughing. That we always kept that part of our resiliency of laughter, laughing at each other, laughing at ourselves. And this is why we have today such a strong component of Indigenous people who kept that language alive. That's our tradition. That's our resilience. It's part of that land that we love. And when we come to the cities, there should be signifiers. Get rid of all these people who promoted colonization and put in symbols of the people of the land.
Yeah. Yeah. At a point, I forget what was it. You good?
Oh, one more thing. Yeah. I know, Ellen Gabriel, right? Every time she speaks, I'm so excited and I'm so inspired, and it's hard to think about the next thought because I could sit for hours. I wanted to bring it back to accountability just for a second. Our Indigenous people are so resilient, and they have survived genocides and ongoing genocides and the active destruction or the attempt to destruct who we are as people. So there's a lot to learn there from Indigenous people, and we're not just saying from certain Indigenous people. In all of your communities, go to the friendship centers, go to the places where we come together as community and get to know the people of the land you're on. I live here in Ottawa, and this is not my territory. This is not where my family is from. So I have been learning from the Algonquin people how to say hello, how to say thank you, how to walk softly on this territory that is not my own, and how to try and be as kind and as gentle as I can. So,
just to touch on language really quick, there was this company that I was talking to, and they told me the story about wanting to go and help their tech company, and they wanted to go help a community, and they're like, what do we need? And they're like, okay, we want to save language. It's like, all right, so we're going to go to this community. We're going to show up. We're going to have really good microphones and really good recorders and terabytes to save all of this stuff. And they brought this to the elders, and the elders are like, whoa, 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 whoa. That's not how you save language. You save language by teaching the kids. You don't archive it and put it away. We should archive it and put it away also, but I'm saying like this, you're taking the wrong steps to revitalizing language, and this isn't it. Like we need to teach the kids. Anyways, thank you so much. Chimigwedge.
thank you. Matsi.
Yawa. Skana senuntunyuhut. Peace be in your mind.